Since the dawn of the 21st century, scientific discovery has rushed forward at lightning speed. Genetics, physics, computerized technology, robotics, virtual reality. Join Derek and Sharon Gilbert as they uncover the truths behind this ultimate scientific deception. Welcome to SciFriday.
Once again, it is time for Welcome to SciFriday. I'm Derek Gilbert.
I'm Sharon Gilbert, and welcome to our home once again. This is going to be part two, a great interview that we started last week, and if you've missed it, go back to the archives, preferably in our app, the GHTV app. But this is part two with Dr. Phillip Silvia.
He's a director of scientific analysis at a dig site in Jordan called Tal el-Hammam.
That's a mouthful.
It is.
Tal just means sort of like tall mountain that's made from lots of civilizations.
Yeah, it's just the Arabic form of the word tel.
Yeah.
In Tel Aviv. It's just,
exactly.
Right. So
yeah,
it's
heap.
And the
Uriah Tell.
If
you're not our age, you won't get that.
No, it's a site that is extends out over the valley, the Jordan Valley, between Mount Nebo and Jericho, and it is not where most scholars historically have placed the site of Sodom, and it's not where some have found, say, the burning balls of sulfur, which is in the southwest side of the Dead Sea.
And I think I can see why people finding those would assume that that's indicative of what happened at Sodom. But the evidence, when you compile all of it, and Dr. Silvia in this series of interviews does not go into everything.
No.
There is overwhelming evidence that this is Sodom.
Right. Their academic paper published last September in a peer-reviewed journal called Scientific Reports, which is a publication of Nature, a secular journal, so not a Christian scientific journal, shows... Well, some of the evidence that we'll get to today regarding the way the pottery was melted, but only partly.
Right.
Yeah, that's just mind-boggling. So wait for that. That'll be in the second half of the program today.
Yeah, and there may even be more information that we'll be able to get after we go to the Archaeology conference in August.
That's right. So watch for that. This is just one of the most stunning archaeological discoveries, I think, of the last century.
You know, I think so too. Before we get to Dr. Silvia, though, there are a few stories in the news that we need to address. One of them, you guys are living through this. At the time you're watching this, it's very likely that we are still in a heat wave. Strangely enough, as we record this on the 15th of June, in parts of the United States, they're getting massive rainfall and snow.
Yellowstone has had massive flooding. We've seen reports from friends in Montana that cattle had to be moved from one pasture to another to get them out of the way of floodwaters. And
but also there's snow. If I sent you the screen cap
yeah.
of, so yeah, there are strange things meteorologically going on in the world, and that actually will connect to Sodom in a little bit, but. Not far from where we are in Kansas, as of this date, the 15th of June, over 10,000 feedlot cattle have died of heat stroke.
That's tragic.
Well, yeah.
I mean, of course, the economic impact is pretty significant too.
It's huge, and it's a huge impact.
Right.
It's a huge impact. And I don't know what the ages of these feedlot cattle are because they vary in age, as you've learned as you discovered the various cattle behind our home.
Just out the back window here, there's a bull up against the fence line, maybe 150 feet from where I sit.
Staring at you.
Yeah, just kind of.
Derek. But right now, it's probably in the high 90s during the day. And at night, it gets about 75. You need to have a big differential between daytime and nighttime because it takes and it would take that bull, who probably weighs 1,200 pounds.
Right.
It would take that bull 4 to 5 hours to dissipate all the heat that he absorbs during the day.
Right.
So you need to have some nice, cooler evenings that allow them to regain their circulatory health. Sadly, because it hasn't been cooling off enough at night, not all of this could happen. And when you're in a feedlot, the steers are a little bit closer together, so they don't. Out here, they're just roaming around, and they have long distances between them. In fact, like he said, the bull is on his own. He's done his business. He's taken a break.
And besides, the tree line is up there against the fences, so he's in the shade.
He is. But it's just an indicator, I think, not of a need for a greener way of living, because I think many Christians tend to recycle and be pretty green anyway. I grew up living in a very green environment because we didn't have plastic.
Well, there's that, but also farmers. I learned when I was working in the steel business, and we had a little retail counter from a steel distribution center. Normally didn't do retail, but we had a retail center where we would sell drops. You know, when you cut a piece of beam or a bar or something like that, and you've got something left over from the 20-foot length, that's a drop. And farmers would often come in and look for drops that they could use to weld, to repair machinery and equipment. So they were often very good about fixing rather than just throwing out and replacing.
Not only farmers. Back when I was a kid, shade tree mechanics were everywhere because you didn't have these super complicated engines with computers running and everything.
Right.
So, and we had, as I said, no plastic. So everything you bought was in a glass jar or bottle.
Right.
And those glass bottles were returnable for money. So every kid was taking that.
And of course the mason jars would washed out and reused as you can and so forth.
Yes, exactly. So, whereas all this plastic, I mean, it's not decomposing.
In a disposable society, essentially.
And kids are disposable too, sadly.
Well, yeah, that's where I was going with that. Yeah. So, but farmers are kind of demonized by the green movement, and especially livestock operations, cattle, hog farming, poultry farming. They want to move us away from animal protein, which the human body needs. And you know more about this than I do, but we are designed to make use of animal protein for optimal health.
Yes, we are. There are a lot of amino acids that you can only get from eating animal protein. And studies that have just come out recently show that if you are getting all of your protein from vegetable sources, then you are not going to be as healthy. Your brain won't function as well. Some claim you'll live longer if you don't eat meat, but that's not true. And your child needs to form certain proteins and functions within his or her body as he or she is growing. And so it's being discovered that children who are raised only as vegetarians aren't as robust. And that includes whether or not their immune systems function correctly.
Well, and they're trying to push us, and again, when I say they, I mean the World Economic Forum and globalists of that ilk, trying to push us toward alternative sources of protein like bugs.
That are more expensive.
Well, yeah.
They are. They're manufactured. Many of them are based on soy and little critter proteins.
But I'm talking about things like crickets and mealworms.
That's what I'm saying. They often augment it with soy. Which means that somebody has to raise the soy.
And then because we have a cultural stigma against eating insects, then they have to process it to make it look like ground beef.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
But this is all part of or chicken. This is all part of a bigger agenda, though. But as we move in this green direction, we are finding our quality of life is declining, not just health-wise, but there was a story that came out recently that startled me, that we here in the central United States are facing a summer of rolling power outages, similar to what California has been enduring the last few summers and what Texas went through winter before last.
Well, let me bring up Texas since you just mentioned it. Texas is becoming the hub for crypto mining here in the United States. Crypto mining for Bitcoin and other crypto, what's the word I want? Cryptocurrency. It takes a lot of power. It takes a lot of power.
It does.
And Texas doesn't have any to spare.
No, it doesn't. Well, it's the same problem that you run into with California, where they are mandating no new internal combustion cars and trucks by the year 2030 or 2035, but the power grid's not able to keep up with demand now. Here in the Midwest, the problem is being caused by the shutdown of coal-fired power plants earlier than expected, but the utility companies who, for this example, in the state of Illinois, they passed a law last year that mandates 100% renewable energy by the year 2050. So as coal-fired power plants come up and need maintenance, the operators are saying, why bother investing millions of dollars in maintaining this old plant that the government says I'm going to have to shut down anyway? Let's just take it offline now. And suddenly, the central part of the U.S., Missouri, Illinois, Louisiana, all the way up to Minnesota into Saskatchewan, all part of the same grid, we don't have enough power for 3.7 million homes. So we've already received our first notice from our local power co-op saying, conserve tomorrow, please. Temperature's only in the low 90s. I mean, it gets above that quite regularly here in the Ozarks. So this is something new for us in the central U.S., and this is all part of the green agenda.
Yeah, well,
as they move us towards solar and wind. Well, good luck with that.
you were talking about 2050, and that we're seeing 2035, 2050, 2045. There are a lot of things taking place in that sort of 15-year span that are being touted as sort of the shift over into the next phase of humanity.
Right.
Well, those mandates have been kicked down the road quite a number of times already.
Right.
Because we have green startups that happen that are supposed to, theoretically, are supposed to fulfill some of those goals, and they don't. So then they shut down, and it's realized, wait a minute, we can't meet that goal, so we'll kick it down the road 5 years and let the next administration take care of it or take the blame for it. As we are moving into an election cycle this fall, as you well know, I think we're going to see a lot of green, promises and helicopter money promises.
Yeah. No doubt.
Yeah.
Well, just remember, as Christians, that doesn't change our mission, which is to make disciples of all nations.
That's exactly it.
Let's, be active in politics, but don't put your hope in salvation there, because our mission does not change regardless of who sits in the Oval Office.
It does not. Well, we need to take a break, and then we'll come back and have Dr. Silvia.
Yep. SciFriday continues after this.
Space is not the final frontier, but there are those who want you to think it is. 75 years ago, something crashed in the desert near Roswell, New Mexico. An industry has grown up to sell the idea that the pilots were extraterrestrials. We want you to know the truth. For a limited time, we're making available a special offer featuring the groundbreaking book, The Day the Earth Stands Still. This book shows step by step how the occult teachings of Madame Blavatsky and Aleister Crowley grew into the ancient aliens hypothesis of the modern UFO movement. It's our Gilbert House Roswell special. For just $35, we'll send you The Day the Earth Stands Still, plus our DVD sets, The Best of SciFriday Volumes 1 and 2. It's a $65 value for just $35. Take advantage of the Gilbert House Roswell special for a limited time only, and you'll only find it at our store, online at gilberthouse.org.
Welcome back to SciFriday. I'm Derek Gilbert.
I'm Sharon Gilbert. Last week I told you about my
yes.
wonderful beaded necklace from Bill Oldchief, and Derek is now remembering about the pins that he brought to show this week. I don't know how you'll need a close-up.
I'm gonna do a close-up shot, that I will put on screen here. But
they're wonderful.
An official pin of the Blackfeet Nation and a buffalo head nickel, which has been turned into a pin. It turns out that the buffalo head nickel features the likeness of a very famous Blackfeet chief by the name of Two Guns White Calf. Two Guns White Calf, who was, as Bill explained it, his father was Bill's great-great-great-grandfather. So,
okay.
Yeah. So, very well known. In fact, he was also the likeness of the Washington Redskins until the Redskins were pressured into changing their name to the Washington Football Team.
It's a shame because he's a very handsome man.
And it has a remarkable story who really stood up and defied the government in Washington, D.C. on behalf of his people. So it could have been a teachable moment, but instead the Redskins just said, okay, and caved in.
Well, because erasing history is what is done. And that's why I love the fact that Dr. Phil Silvia is digging up all of this biblical history.
Yes. Pay close attention, take notes. The evidence for Tal el-Hammam, a site in Jordan directly across from Jericho, as the biblical Sodom. Joining us again this week is the Director of Scientific Analysis and Field Director for the excavation at Tal el-Hammam. In all probability, the site of ancient Sodom. We welcome Dr. Phillip Silvia back to the program. Phil, last time we were talking about the significance of the evidence and the locational evidence of Sodom. Your work, in conjunction with a whole team of experts of various disciplines, has been to identify what it was that actually blew that city apart in the Middle Bronze Age around 1700 BC. If it wasn't a freak accident of lightning igniting methane coming out of the Dead Sea, and remembering for viewers that this site is about 8.5 miles northeast of the Dead Sea, what was it? What does the evidence point to?
Well, what piqued our curiosity at the very beginning, and I should say that the excavation started in 2005. I joined the team on the site in 2012, which was season 7 of the excavation project. We've now completed 15 seasons. What we started to find was evidence of directionality to the destruction event, in that all of the debris seemed to be pushed in a single direction, which didn't fit any of the typical destruction profiles. And I'd mentioned this, in the previous interview when we talked about earthquakes falling in 2 directions. Everything here moved in 1 direction. Doesn't fit the normal conquest pattern. So that was curious. And then we started finding odd pieces of material. And by odd, I mean lots of broken pottery, but we started to find occasional pieces that were partially melted to the point of turning the clay of the pottery into glass. Not entirely, but on the surface. We refer to that as vitrified or turned to glass pottery. We took one sample of that and sent it down to New Mexico Tech in Socorro to have it analyzed down there by some material scientists down there. And what we noted was that particular broken piece of pottery, imagine it's only 1/4 of an inch thick, 5 millimeters thick. And if you think of my fingers as each one representing 1 millimeter, the top 1 millimeter of this 1/4 inch thick piece was melted entirely to glass. The next 2 millimeters were thermally darkened, and then the bottom 2 millimeters of this slice of broken pottery was unaltered. So it was a natural color. And we're trying, what kind of process could that fragment have been exposed to that would get it hot enough to melt the surface to glass, but not melt the whole thing down? And bear in mind that this was found in what we call a sealed Middle Bronze Age context, which would date it to about 1700 BC. At first, we thought it was glazed pottery, but we know in that region of the world, glazing of pottery didn't occur till about 600 AD. We're at 1700 BC. So what was the process that occurred that melted just the surface of that piece of pottery? And that's when we began to realize we are dealing with some very high, very short duration temperatures associated with this destruction event. And the more we kept looking, the more we came to the conclusion that not only were we talking about extremely high and brief temperature, but also very strong concussive force. In other words, there was some kind of a blast that occurred that was able to knock buildings completely off of their foundation, pulverize mud bricks, literally blow that material into the next county somewhere because it was nowhere to be found except for very limited sections of debris. And that got us thinking, it got me thinking for part of my doctoral dissertation, that this has the appearance of a meteoritic impact or airburst event, because that is the only naturally occurring phenomenon that could produce the kinds of effects that we were beginning to see and uncover at the site. I mean, sure, a nuclear bomb could have gone off, but obviously 1700 BC, that doesn't make any sense, and nothing's radioactive. So we rule that out. So the only natural occurring force was a meteoritic impact or airburst event, and that was the beginning then of the hypothesis that we began chasing to see if we could find sufficient evidence to be able to say with some degree of certainty that, yes, this is what did it. Over the subsequent time, since that initial look for me in 2012. In 2014, a group referred to as the Comet Research Group joined me in this quest. They have been studying airburst and impact phenomenon around the world for about 15 years. They've developed a lot of the scientific protocols to investigate the materials, identify what kind of materials should you be looking for. And they joined the party, as I said, in 2014, and have worked with me and supported me in this effort all of this time. And the more we looked, the more material evidence we found pointing to an airburst or impact event. Now, we pretty much ruled out an impact event because there is no crater nearby. By the directionality, we knew that the force of the blast approached from a southwest direction because everything was pushed northeasterly, which from the location of Tal el-Hammam, if you stand at the top of the upper Tell and you look to the southwest, what you're looking at is the north end of the Dead Sea, is visible from our site. And so part of that hypothesis was, well, it appears as though the blast occurred somewhere over the north end of the Dead Sea. That was what we would call the epicenter. The other thing that we discovered very early on is that when we were excavating, particularly on the lower city, the lower portion, which is kind of round and flat compared to the upper portion of the city, which is very long and narrow, when we would scrape the surface of the soil during the day with our excavation, and we'd go home at night, we'd come back the next morning, there would be a white haze on the surface of the ground. And that we found very curious. We discovered that that was actually salt leaching out of the soil because of the lower temperatures at night, the slightly higher humidity would leach salt to the surface. And so in 2014, I took some soil samples. We had done a deep cut into the site that we were excavating on the lower Tell, and the vertical wall, we call that the balk, the vertical wall of this sounding, this hole that we dug to take a quick look at the stratigraphy, was dug in 2011. 3 years later, in 2014, I jumped down into that sounding and noticed that there was a 1/4 inch thick layer of salt that had leached out of that wall and had formed a crust, a 1/4 inch thick on that wall. We chipped that off, and there's the Middle Bronze Age destruction layer. We could see it. And I took soil samples above and below it. We sent those samples out to a lab for geochemical testing and discovered that the salts that were contained in that soil were identical chemically to the water of the Dead Sea.
8.5 miles away.
8.5 miles away. Exactly right. But we also noticed that when we looked at the concentration of those salts in those samples that I took above, through, and below the destruction layer, they peaked in the destruction layer at over 6% by weight. So you had a 6% salt content in the destruction layer, and then it very rapidly tapered off above and below it. So it was the destruction layer that got saturated.
So whatever exploded over the north end of the Dead Sea, and we just have a couple of minutes left here, it
Sure.
basically distributed Dead Sea salt water across the plains of Moab there, the Kikar, the disc north of the Dead Sea, and as high up as 75 feet above the plains, the valley floor on the lower level of the city.
Yes, and so that added to the thought that the north end of the Dead Sea was the epicenter for whatever this explosion was that created this high temperature profile, that created this concussive force that blew everything off of its foundations. So all of that added to say, okay, we think we know where the blast occurred. In the air, over the north end of the Dead Sea, enough to push that temperature profile, push that concussive force across, and also to push with it a sufficient volume of water from the north end of the Dead Sea to basically poison the soil in the fertile plains around it, as well as the lower Tell itself. So as we kept digging, we found more and more evidence that all pointed to an airburst event. And by some of the evidence, we're talking about, high concentrations of rare earth elements that only appear as a result of asteroid-type airburst events, thermal profiles that only occur as a result of airburst or impact events. All of that material, all of that evidence started pointing in a direction to the point where we came to the conclusion, as we published in the paper that you just mentioned, that we had on our hands here an airburst event that had basically wiped out the city. And that's the paper that we just published. And not only that, we believe it was a Tunguska class event. And by that I mean, I'm making reference to the airburst event that occurred over Tunguska, Siberia in 1908 that decimated 2,200 square kilometers of tundra forest in northern Siberia. We had an event of that class, perhaps even greater, that occurred over that circular plain at the north end of the Dead Sea that wiped out Tal el-Hammam and every other urban center in the region, all simultaneously, all at about 1700 BC.
Boy, the broken pottery partly melted into glass. The way he explained it, just the top millimeter being glazed, the next two being burned, and the bottom two being untouched.
This is long before humans actually glazed pottery.
Right. Very
like 2,000 years before.
Yeah. Very intense heat, but for a very, very brief moment, an explosion that just turned that top millimeter of pottery into glass.
And the story about the soil?
Yes, the fact that the high concentration of salt found in the soil made it unusable for agriculture down to the time of David and Solomon, which explains why Moses and the Israelites camped at a place called Abel Shittim, which means meadow of the acacias, because acacia is salt tolerant. So when they got there 400 years later, nothing would grow except for these acacias. And it also explains the story of Lot's wife.
Yes, it does.
Think about that. 8.5 miles away, salt water dropped from the Dead Sea. Lot's wife had turned around to go back, and she got caught in that superheated brine and coated with salt and turned into a pillar of salt.
Oh, my goodness. That is such an amazing story. Part 3 is next week, so you do not want to miss that. Download our app. Go to gilberthouse.org and go to the Get Our Free App page.
Gets you all of our video content, and including classic episodes of our podcast that started this whole journey, this whole adventure, PID Radio, Peering into Darkness Radio, the very first interview with Tom Horn. Online. Yeah.
Don't miss that.
Thanks for watching. This is SciFriday.
SciFriday is a viewer-supported outreach of Gilbert House Ministries. Follow us online at scifriday.tv and gilberthouse.org. That's where you'll find our weekly Bible study, the Gilbert House Fellowship. Join us each week as we go through the Bible verse by verse in chronological order. We'd love to hear from you. Contact us through our websites or drop us a line at P.O. Box 78, Crane, Missouri 65633.